Hello, TradingView community. Welcome to my new analysis about CHFJPY. And within the recent times, CHFJPY developed some important developments, and they are forming some very crucial dynamics here for CHFJPY. And within this chart is actually showing a hugely overbought condition for CHFJPY, and it has to be mentioned that CHFJPY was already overbought since it pushed it into the new all-time high area here. Within these dynamics, since it moved into this new all-time high, it was already overbought, and there should have been a major pullback from there on into the bearish direction and showing up with bearish pressure from there on. And this did not happen. This means that CHFJPY is much more overbought right now, and it gets more overbought day by day since it moved into these new areas here. And this is a really crucial dynamic to consider here for CHFJPY from the bearish perspective. And what normally happens when the price of a forex pair is that much overbought, this means that there's a likely bearish pressure setting up and a huge bearish pullback to show up with major bearish momentum and volatility into the bearish dynamic perspectives. And when looking at the world dynamics here for the Swiss franc and the Japanese yen, this means that there's a huge capital flow deficit between these two currencies. This means that within the Swiss franc, there's a capital minus 2.5 billion in capital flows. That this means that there's a huge demand decrease and a huge supply increase within the Swiss franc, and this is putting a lot of bearish pressure onto the Swiss franc. And this is not a wonder why the bearish dynamics are likely to set up within the next times. And just when looking at this world dynamic, the Swiss franc is now really overbought, and this this capital flow deficit within the Swiss franc is putting a lot of pressure on the Swiss franc against the Japanese yen. And when looking at this world dynamic here, also what has to be mentioned on the daily time frame perspective is this huge ascending trend line here. This major ascending trend line which CHFJPY has shown upward. And within this ascending trend line, CHFJPY pull it back several times bearishly to the downside, always rejecting from this ascending trend line. And this is a major bearish development that CHFJPY actually show it upward. And this is a huge bearish development here, always pulling back from this ascending trend line. And the more often the price actually pulls back with these volatility spikes, look at these bearish volatility spikes into the bearish direction. The more often the price actually pulls back with these bearish volatility spikes, the higher the possibility for a much larger bearish pullback into the bearish direction. And this means that the bearish likelihood possibility setup perspective is actually setting up with these major bearish pullbacks to the downside. Also, when looking at this world dynamic here on the daily time frame perspective, this overbought pattern here, this is a major overbought pattern. This means that below every low within this whole structure, there are long positions located, net long positions that have been opened by traders who are still bullish within this pair. And this means that if these long positions are triggered to the downside, this means that this will lead to a huge long liquidation setup, bearish momentum, gravestone into the lower directions. And also when looking at this whole ascending trendline dynamic here, this is actually a huge pattern which is setting up for CHFJPY in this whole dynamic here, because this is a major ascending wedge formation. And as I already mentioned it within previous analysis ideas, is that such a ascending wedge formation is likely to lead to a breakdown into the bearish directions for a 90% possibility when this bull formation has finally completed. And as it seems now, this formation is likely to complete sooner than later. And in this case, what has to be mentioned is that once this whole completion of this ascending wedge formation has been set up with the breakdown below the lower boundary, this will accelerate the heavily bearish dynamics, because there will many long liquidations will be triggered below these levels. And then also when considering this RSI dynamic, the RSI is already overbought, and the RSI is also building this main ascending wedge formation, which is also putting a lot of pressure on this whole dynamic. And when this wedge formation within the RSI has been also completed, this will be another confirmation development for this whole ascending wedge formation to complete into the bearish directions. And in this case, this will trigger a lot of long positions down the line, down the road, and increase with heavy bearish pressures down the road. And in this case, when considering this whole dynamic here, once this whole ascending wedge formation has been completed, the target zones will be within this lower level here, within the 150 level, which has been the main breakout area before of this weak, fragile, bullish uptrend, which is likely to turn within the next times. And in this case, the targets will be within this main level, within the 150 area. And once these targets have been reached, it will be important how the actual price action actually sets up from there, because when there's a lot of bearish pressure in this case, this is also likely to lead to the next formation in this case, when the price action shows up with huge bearish pressure in this whole dynamic. This will lead to the next formation in this whole dynamic, and it is likely to lead to further bearish pressure down the line. And in this case, CHFJPY is forming this huge, massive, gigantic, paramount, extensive head and shoulders formation, which is likely to complete when the bearish pressure moves into these remaining support zones with a huge bearish pressure and into the 300 EMA market in red. Once the bearish pressure accelerates heavily into these dynamics, this will set up the next bearish wave into the lower levels. And when looking at this whole global dynamic here, this will be a major gravestone pattern doomsday scenario for CHF JPY. And once these whole dynamics have been set up, this will actually trigger a lot of further bearish dynamics into these lower dynamics. And once this whole formation has been set up, this will lead to further bearish pressure down the line and further bearish dynamics into the lower directions. And in this case, this will lead to further triggers here down the line. And in this case, when looking at this whole dynamic here, this should be projected onto the breakout areas. And when just considering this scenario, this will trigger a lot of bearish pressure and a lot of more long liquidations, because there are still many longs within this market which will be triggered by this scenario. And then it will be important how the bearish pressure actually sets up and how it continues after that. With this being said, it will be a very important dynamic here to watch out with in the next times. Once the trigger approaches have been set up, we will consider this dynamic again. We will reconsider this dynamic and we will look on the changes within this pair, having the pair CHFJPY from a bearish perspective on our watch list and see how the main formational triggers set up here. With this being said, it will be great when you support my project further with a like, follow, and comment. And therefore, bye bye.